All right, we've talked a little bit about imperialism in general in the late 19th century. Let's talk about America's embrace of that as well. Seems ironic, a republic becoming an empire, but that's what happened. The nation had been expansionist since the beginning. In the last years of the 19th century, with little potential left for territorial expansion on the continent, U.S. expansionism moved into a new phase, very different. Before, the expansion was contiguous. It involved settlement, and these places had the potential to become states. The expansionism of the 1890s, sort of the new manifest destiny, involved acquiring a territory that was not on the continent, not contiguous, that was already thickly populated, would not attract massive U.S. settlement, and would not become states, i.e., would become colonies. The U.S. rushed to join European powers, an imperial drive that would bring much of the underdeveloped world under the control of industrial powers. Now, several developments helped shift Americans to an imperialist viewpoint. The experience of subjugating Indians on the plains established a precedent for exerting colonial control over dependent peoples who were not citizens. The concept of the closing of the frontier, this was Frederick Jackson Turner's famous frontier thesis, you'll recall, produced fears that natural resources would soon dwindle and other sources would need to be found abroad. So to expand the frontier continually, that was one reason. There was a bitter depression, you'll recall, that began in 1893, the Panic of 1893, and that encouraged some businessmen to look for overseas markets. The bitter social protest of the time, free silver, populism, violent labor disputes, led some to conclude that a more aggressive foreign policy would provide an outlet for destabilizing forces. Let's shift people's attention to foreign policy and get them off, get their minds off labor problems, for example. Foreign trade was becoming increasingly important to the American economy. In 1870, $392 million in exports. In 1890, $857 million in exports. In 1900, $1.4 billion. Many began to consider acquiring colonies to expand export markets further. Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana, who is also a historian, by the way, said, "Today we are raising more than we can consume. We are making more than we can use. Therefore, we must find new markets for our produce, new occupation for our capital, new work for our labor. We need new markets." Americans were well aware of the imperialist fever raging in Europe, with Africa and the feeble Chinese Empire as the new targets, and they just didn't want to be left out. Here we see the map of Africa at the beginning of World War I. The white parts are the independent parts. You have to kind of look hard. Basically, Liberia and the Abyssinian Empire, present-day Ethiopia, was about all that was left, and Ethiopia would be snapped up before too many more decades. Henry Cabot Lodge, name to remember, an important Republican senator from Massachusetts, was a leading imperialist, and he was very vocal about this. We can't be left behind. Scholars and others found justification for these ideas in social Darwinism. You'll recall that social Darwinism, scientific racism, were all the rage in this era. And they simply applied it on an international scale. Only the fittest races or nations should survive. For strong nations to dominate weaker ones was simply natural law. A scholar named John Fiske, who's a philosopher and historian, predicted in an 1885 Harper's Magazine article that English-speaking peoples would eventually control every land that was not already the seat of a, quote, established civilization, unquote. Fiske said that experience of white Americans in subjugating the native population of this continent was destined to continue in other parts of the world. In the same year, a Protestant clergyman, a preacher named Josiah Strong, championed overseas missionary work. In his book, Our Country, Its Possible Future, and Its Present Crisis, he declared the Anglo-Saxon race, there's no such thing, but the Anglo-Saxon race, especially its American branch, represented the great ideas of civil liberty and pure Christianity, and was divinely commissioned to spread its institutions all over the earth. He was a reformer, and he was paternalistic in his racism, but we have to go help the brown people. John W. Burgess, Columbia University's School of Political Science professor, gave scholarly approval to imperialism. In his book, Political Science and Comparative Law, he concluded that Anglo-Saxon and Teutonic nations had the greatest political talents and therefore had a duty to uplift less fortunate peoples. Quote, "There is no human right to the status of barbarism." The greatest apostle of imperialism, however, was Captain Alfred T. Mahan, later an admiral, but a captain when he wrote this book, U.S. naval captain. And the thesis of his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, was that countries with sea power were the great nations of history, and the greatness of the U.S., bounded on two sides by oceans, would rest on sea power. I believe Bailey calls him in your reading the high priest of navalism. Mahan's prerequisites for sea power were this: a productive domestic economy, check; foreign commerce, check; strong merchant marine, check; a navy to defend trade routes, that was growing; and next, colonies to provide raw materials and markets to serve as naval bases. We didn't have that yet. So his recommendations were this: build a canal across the isthmus of Central America, put defensive bases, naval bases on both sides in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and take possession of Hawaii and other Pacific islands to use as coaling stations to make this navy work. Mahan feared the U.S. did not have a large enough navy for the great role he envisioned. But in the 1870s and 1880s, the U.S. launched a shipbuilding program that by 1898 had moved the U.S. to fifth place, and by 1900 to third place, third largest navy in the world. The 1890s saw America, if not establishing global dominance, beginning to establish hemispheric hegemony. James G. Blaine served as Secretary of State in two Republican administrations in the 1880s and led early efforts to expand American influence in Latin America, where he believed the U.S. must look for markets for surplus goods. This was called spirited diplomacy. In October of 1889, he organized the first Pan American Congress, which attracted delegates from 19 nations. The delegates agreed to create the Pan American Union, a weak international organization that sort of served as a clearinghouse for distributing information to member nations. They rejected Blaine's grander vision for an inter-American customs and arbitration sort of court for hemispheric disputes. Obviously, Washington would dominate this, and they didn't want that. Blaine really, his vision was sort of the forerunner for the great trade blocs of this century. The Cleveland administration was equally interested in Latin America. In 1895, it supported Venezuela in a dispute with Great Britain over the boundary between Venezuela and British Guyana. It was one of those situations where nobody had really cared about the vague boundary, but all of a sudden gold was discovered in this contested area. The U.S. demanded the matter be sent to arbitration. When Britain ignored this demand, Secretary of State Richard Olney charged Britain with violating the Monroe Doctrine. When Britain still did not act, Cleveland set up a special commission to settle the dispute and said that Britain should resist the decision, or should Britain resist the decision of this arbitration panel, he declared the U.S. would go to war. Britain realized this was a major diplomatic crisis and agreed to the arbitration. So America was flexing its muscle and showing its hemispheric dominance. Hawaii was an important way station for American ships trading with China, even in the early 19th century. By the 1880s, American naval officers were coveting the wonderful Pearl Harbor on Oahu as a permanent U.S. naval base. Pressure for an American presence in Hawaii was growing for another reason as well. A lot of Americans had settled on the island and had come to dominate the economic and political life there. You already know the story from your reading. The white settlers orchestrated a rebellion against Queen Liliuokalani and then put in place a constitutional government which begged for annexation. Samoa is a similar story.